that table, that dining table, is so crucial for the emotions and the psychological health of the team in the space station. It's quite remarkable. And these are things that sometimes, from a rational engineering perspective, you leave them out, but then culture seeps in, and these are very human things.
Hi there, welcome again to the IFAMA 2020 Goes Digital show. I am one of the hosts of the show and my name is Bianca van der Haan. And today I am talking with Angelo Vermeulen on life on the moon and life on Mars and what it's going to look like and what we are going to eat there. And Angelo is a biologist, he's an artist, and he's also a space researcher. He works for the Delft University of Technology. So, Angelo, tell us, what if we're going to live on the moon and on Mars? What is it going to look like?
Well, that's a huge question, of course. I think the whole settlement of the moon and Mars is going to happen in different stages, of course. I mean, we're not going to build a city just like that. And I'm not sure if that's the immediate goal, to build an actual city on Mars, for example. The first missions to the moon and Mars will be mostly about visiting and doing some research and coming back, much like during the Apollo missions. But I think the next step will be to develop the development of research stations. Habitats that would only be inhabited for a short amount of time, where researchers try to gather as much data as they can during their limited missions. But these are not the kind of settlements or colonies that people imagine, like actually establishing an independent settlement where even children are born and people grow their own food and have their own economies and all that sort of stuff. Ideas that are proposed by people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, those things are really, really far off. And it's a little difficult to gauge how they will actually look like. Now, the thing is, the environment, especially on Mars, is very dangerous. We know the space environment is very dangerous, but one of the biggest problems is radiation. So a lot of the architecture will be either underground or will be covered with soil, lunar soil or Martian soil. So you won't really see a lot of those beautiful greenhouses on the surface of Mars or transparent architectures. It'll all be buried deep and protected well against that radiation. So from the outside, I think it's going to look less spectacular than in some of the science fiction movies we know.
And what will we eat there?
Well, it's pretty clear that for long-duration space missions, at a certain point, we will have to grow food. The astronauts will have to grow their own food. You can't, for a very long mission, taking all the food supplies would make your spaceship massive. It would just be way too heavy. And so recycling part of your waste and then using that to grow food in your spaceship or on a settlement, and a settlement on the moon or Mars is going to be part of our future in space. So that's definitely going to happen. Ideally, we would aim for a fully circular system. And actually, the European Space Agency has been working for decades on such a system, and they've developed all kinds of components for such a system. And the system is called Melissa. And the idea is basically that all molecules that come out of the human body, all human waste, is basically captured and is then gradually, those molecules are gradually being broken down by a series of bioreactors. And the goal is to produce nitrates, food, and CO2 for the plants, and then those plants provide food and oxygen for the astronauts again. So you get a fully circular system. That's the ideal world. It's not that easy. So what I think what will really happen is a combination of both. We'll have astronauts living in deep space, partly growing their own food, and then partially getting resupplied by Earth. So a combination of that seems like the most realistic. Now, space food has its own challenges, of course. You don't want to take a freezer into your spaceship, basically. So you need shelf-stable ingredients, and that's, it's a challenge of its own. To have a shelf-stable food supply that still is very tasty and very healthy and contains enough vitamins, but there's a lot of expertise that has been built around this. I mean, we've been in space for many, many decades. So in the International Space Station, the food is, I would say, I haven't tasted it myself, but it looks pretty good, I must say.
And what does it contain? Will we eat meat there, or cheese, or will it be solely plant-based, beans?
Yeah, there will be a few shifts in cuisine, let's put it this way. First of all, I think there will be a big focus on plant-based food. The Melissa system, for example, is basically a vegan system. It's consisting of crops and bacteria, and they all work together with the astronauts to create food. Cattle, livestock, poultry, these are not good ideas in space. I mean, basically because they're not efficient. As we all know, it takes a lot of resources to create a steak or any piece of meat. This is something that is not compatible with the constraints of space. But there are other ways to vary your offer of food in space. And so, for example, you can imagine adding insects, for example. I think insect proteins are definitely a very interesting and easy alternative to grow in space. And so there's all kinds of ways in which we could expand the offer of food items in space.
Yeah, and here on Earth, livestock is also used to eat our leftovers.
Yes.
So they actually have different purposes here in the food system. What will you do with the leftovers on the moon or with the leftovers on Mars?
Yeah, true.
If we don't have livestock.
If we don't have livestock, what do you do with all those?
Yeah.
Yes. There are many different ways in which this could be used. For example, in the Melissa system, you use bioreactors with particular bacteria that break down that waste, and then those molecules are being moved to the next bioreactor, and gradually we end up in nutrient plants. But I could also imagine regular composting. I mean, it is still, it could also work on the moon. Why not? And then, like I said before, insects can also be used to eat leftovers from crops. And then you get insect proteins, mushrooms. So there's all these possibilities that are actually they're around. And some of these technologies have been around for thousands of years, basically. The challenge is really by using all these different approaches, bioreactors and composting and insects and mushrooms and different types of crops, how do you create a system that is relatively small scale, because we're not talking about massive fields of wheat. I mean, this is much more small scale food production. So how do you make a system in which everything is working with everything, and you don't get an oversupply of one system gets too much and the other system is under is not properly functioning. So how do you balance a system like this on a small scale? It's quite a challenge, and it is really crucial to think about scale, because, for example, Biosphere 2, the famous experiment in Arizona in the 90s, where people lived in a greenhouse complex together with inside different ecosystems and an agricultural system. Also there, the problem was how to balance all those organisms, and they introduced like about 3,000 organisms, and the whole ecosystem kind of collapsed. And it's basically because the reservoirs in these self-contained systems are quite small. When we're growing food here, even in horticulture or outside, you have the atmosphere that provides you with permanent oxygen. This is a whole different story, of course, in any space settlement.
Yeah, so this is really a technical way of looking at it, but food also has a social benefits, psychological benefits. If you look at the social and psychological side of food in space, what could you say about that?
Well, I've actually participated in a mission for NASA that was specifically researching this. I was the commander of the first HISEAS mission, and HISEAS was a Mars simulation program set up by NASA a couple of years ago, and it's basically a base, a Martian base, or a simulated Martian base on the flank of the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii, and long isolation missions were set up there. And I lived together with 5 other people, isolated from the outside world during 4 months in that location. And one of our main research objectives was to do a very detailed food study. And the food study was basically set up because of the following reason. Even though the food in the International Space Station for the astronauts has been developed very elaborately and has evolved quite a bit, still there is the risk of menu fatigue. People, astronauts, getting a little sick and tired of eating the same kind of meals over and over again. And psychologically, basically your body needs the food, but you just can't eat the same food again. You don't want skinny astronauts to arrive on Mars, right? You want healthy astronauts in space. So in order to tackle that food problem, the suggestion in our research was, what would happen if you allow a space crew to cook their own food, instead of only providing these ready meals? And so we got a whole supply of shelf-stable ingredients. And basically our study was the following. We had 2 days of astronaut food, or something that looked like astronaut food, and then 2 days of free cooking. We could improvise with whatever we want, and it had a huge impact. There's a lot of creativity that went into those meals, because it's really one of the things that you miss when you're living in isolation like this is, and I think people will relate to this because of COVID-19, and many of us have been living under lockdown. But you seek for outlets for creativities, for novelty, and being able to improvise with those ingredients was really wonderful. But also, it really stimulates conversation. If you're cooking with somebody else, you start to talk about all kinds of things, and when you share the food, the act of sharing something that you created to your fellow crew members has this huge psychological effect. So it really improves crew cohesion as well. And so there's all these interesting psychological and social dynamics that are really important to take into account when we're talking about establishing food culture in outer space.
Nice, interesting. I think you've answered all my questions. Is there anything that you would like to say about space cuisine?
Yeah, there's an interesting anecdote, and it's quite a famous one. When the International Space Station was designed, one of the things that the designers left out was they left out tables. Because they were like, we have zero gravity, so we're going to conceive the architecture of the space station in a different way than terrestrial architecture. Terrestrial architecture has a floor and a ceiling, but these things don't make any sense in space. So all sides can be floors and ceilings. So they had a complete different design of the inside of the interior architecture of the space station. And a table didn't really fit in that concept. I mean, what's the point of a table? The thing is, as soon as the astronauts started using the International Space Station, they demanded a table. They were like, at the end of the day, we want to sit at a table and share food and share stories. Even if it's in zero gravity, we'll pretend that it's a regular table. And of course, on the table, you have all kinds of mechanisms to keep things on the table, like elastic bands and Velcro strips to make sure that things don't float away. And so when astronauts are sitting at their dining table, they're not really sitting, they're more like floating around it. But that idea, that table, that dining table is so crucial for the emotions and the psychological health of the team in the space station. Is quite remarkable. And these are things that sometimes from a rational engineering perspective, you leave them out, but then culture seeps in, and these are very human things. And personally, I find this intersection between culture and engineering extremely fascinating.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Angelo.
You're welcome. When you're living in space, you have one resupply every so often, so you're very conscious about resources. And here on Earth, we're still living with the idea that many resources are infinite, and that just doesn't really stimulate this more circular thinking.